Hello, I'm Nisi Shawl. I'm a writer, and with me is Eileen Gunn, another writer and editor. We're co-hosting this show, and we have a special guest, a perceptive observer of humanity and of life in general, a poet whose long familiarity with language allows her to use it wisely and sparingly without awe or contempt. Ursula K. Guin is a wonderful, wonderful writer who's written some wonderful, wonderful books. And she's here with us today. We're so very happy and fortunate to have her here to talk about, among other things, her latest novel, Gifts. Welcome, Ursula.
Thank you, Nisi.
This novel, Gifts, is it's about two young people with gifts, with mental abilities that most of us here would call paranormal. And both have problems accepting and using these abilities. How did you decide that the story was the young man's Oryx story rather than Gry's?
I don't decide these things. They're presented to me. Oryx tells the story. You know, it's in his voice.
Yeah.
And that's how it came. It's sort of like Joan of Arc. I get voices talking in my ear, and my job is to write them down. And it was the first idea of the book. In this case, I really, where do you get your ideas from is that deadly question. People always think a book starts with a sort of an intellectual thought. But this one had an idea, which was simply that somebody who was supposed to be a magician, a wizard, probably by inheritance, wasn't. And what would it be like to find out that you were supposed to have this great power, and maybe you didn't, or it wasn't developing rightly, and so on. That was sort of the idea from which the whole book started. And that was Oryx right from the start. I didn't know his name yet, but that was this boy whose father had the power and who was therefore expected to have the power.
Where did the powers come from? I mean, which voices were telling you that some of these people could call animals and some of them could turn their enemies into formless masses?
I don't know. As I wrote the book, I began to realize, along with Guy, the character, that these are powers, almost all of which are pretty sinister and scary, that they could be healing powers or powers for good gone wrong, misused.
Right.
Because power corrupts. So like these powers had corrupted themselves. But there was, writing a book to me particularly, well, that's always been true, is sort of a process of discovering what the book is about as I go along.
Okay.
So I just, I don't know what the powers were, just...
So they weren't based on some society that you'd studied or...
No, of course I try to get as far away from, anything specifically like any known society, this being a fantasy, in a fantasy landscape. I try not to make it like the Maori or the Watusi or anybody known,
Yeah. Well, the society as a whole, it did remind me of my time in the Highlands of Scotland, but...
Oh, you've been there?
Oh, yeah, I lived there for a while.
Is it as bleak as...
It's as bleak and as beautiful as Oryx's assessment of his home country. But what I found really interesting, and this might tie into some larger issues, is that the conventional way to approach superpowers, wizardly mental powers in fantasy fiction is to make the possessors of it mighty, powerful rulers of the country, a special caste of priests. Mm-hmm. And in gifts, the people who have these powers they're sort of on the very fringe of society. They're not the most powerful people in their continent, their country even.
They seem to have been marginalized.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if I can follow that idea. Why that's how they appeared to me. Maybe because, in a sense, this is a story about magic going wrong or being used wrongly. Mm-hmm. There's sort of, is there a right way to use a power like Oryx, which is to unmake living beings, make them all messed up inside, If there is, these people having been marginalized, being maybe pushed aside, kind of like witches were pushed aside and and I think the village witch was usually a kind of marginal person in the Middle Ages. She had power, but it didn't make her beloved.
Right.
It just made her useful.
So this is a larger scale.
So this is kind of like witches being pushed off into the poor lands, the uplands, and sort of settling down there and just fighting each other, misusing their power against one another.
Why does this sound familiar?
Well, we have had fantasies which follow this. That's all that magic is used for, is to fight other magicians.
Or all that technology is used for, all that, in a larger political sense.
That. Yeah.
We have this amazing technology at our disposal, and to a great extent we use it to fight one another with.
Yeah, to make weapons of instead of anything really useful. Yeah.
Last night at Elliott Bay Books, you were talking about the intersection between politics and literature, and I think this is a good example of the way that literature can be extrapolated to be extremely relevant to our immediate everyday life.
Which seems to be something that a lot of critics and professors and so on have great trouble understanding this about fantasy and science fiction. They seem to refuse the obvious fact that mostly serious fantasy and science fiction is just a way of talking about things right now and the way we are and the way we live, just as much as any realistic fiction is. It's just a different approach. It's an approach at one remove, kind of, which can give you a different view of things and allow you to talk about them. But I did not, I have to say that writing a book, I didn't have the present world situation particularly in mind in Gifts. It was just sort of human nature about how mean we are to each other and how we seem to make a quarrel even when there isn't any reason to. And to always get to feuding, because it's about feuds. But of course a feud is just a small war.
When you write, do you think about the metaphoric content of your work before you finished?
No, I kind of, if anything, I avoid thinking about it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it kind of forces itself on my attention. And after all, like I said, I did have this sort of general idea of this book in mind to start with, that it was a case of magic either being lost or going wrong or changing somehow. And so I did have that, and that is kind of to me, kind of powerful idea right there that does kind of reflect on a lot of things, like any sort of gift that either isn't what you thought it was going to be, as many gifts aren't, or actually is not what you expected out of life. This is not what you thought you were going to be doing, or not the person you thought you were going to be. This is something that is so common to adolescents, right? Life is just not what they thought it was going to be. And it's way more difficult and complicated than it looked like when you were maybe 9 or 10. So, and this is a young adult book. I mean, after all, the protagonists are adolescents.
Is that what makes it a young adult book, the age of the protagonist?
That's all I know that makes a young adult book a young adult book. Which means that Romeo and Juliet is a young adult play, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's 14, I believe.
She's 14, he's like 17.
Yeah. Yeah. So how is writing a young adult novel different from writing for adults? If is there any other technique or approach other than the age of the protagonists that you wind up with?
Not for me. They're just people. They just happen to be young people. So basically it's just a kind of novel to me. I hadn't written a young adult as such. It's a publisher's category and a bookseller's category largely. I hadn't written one for years, and it was sort of nice because there is a certain. If you're writing what's going to be sold as a young adult novel, you know that you're going to be read by people from 11 through 18 or so. And they're real good readers. They're a wonderful bunch to write for. They read hard and they take books to their hearts in the way that some adults sometimes learn to defend themselves. Kids don't defend themselves from art. They're open to it. So it's a wonderful bunch of people to aim a book at. But I don't feel, particularly in fantasy, which if you like fantasy, you usually learn to like it as a kid.
Yeah.
And you go on. You go on the rest of your life. And we fantasy seems to transcend age categories very, almost uniquely. Actually, I think most genre fiction. Science fiction transcends age categories too, because kids read hard science fiction books quite young, don't they?
I did.
Very, very grown-up stuff. It's something you get onto when you're what, 12 or 13?
If you call that young as a reader. I mean, I was reading science fiction, but not hard science fiction, when I was 6 or 7.
Like what?
There was a book called Space Cat. There was actually a series of books. I think it was by Ruthven Todd, and this astronaut has a cat, and it's told from the cat's point of view, of course, and
a good thing.
Yeah. They go to Mars, and the soil is all bouncy, and it's full of jewels, and
so it's really something between science fiction and fantasy.
They didn't know, but they were pretty sure that there weren't any jewels on Mars at the time.
Yeah. But what do you care when you're 6? I mean,
right. Or in the wonderful flight to the mushroom planet.
Yes, which turned on a whole generation of people.
Right.
Eleanor Cameron.
Yeah.
You talked last night about fiction as a source of social change and of people imagining, especially younger people, imagining a different world. Fiction being a road to that imagining.
Right. There again, young readers, their minds are not formed, their opinions are not yet formed, so that I think they often come to a story with an open mind and are more willing to be changed by an imagination of a different way of living or a different way of doing things. The mind has not yet put on the shutters and closed the doors, as so many adult minds do. Maybe in sort of self-defense, but anyway. So there's a certain vulnerability about young readers, which means that they're a wonderful audience. You also have to be a little careful. The only difference I know between writing for adults and writing for children, really, is you take a certain care about, it's not protecting them, but there's certain things, there's a certain kind of despair that maybe you leave out of the book. And that sounds like self-censorship, and it doesn't feel. It's like treating kids. There's certain things you just don't put kids through if you can help it,
Yeah.
and that just carries over into writing for them, just like being with them. You don't tell them all is lost, kid. Go bury yourself, because they can't. They're young. They're going to live anyway, and you got to give them a little. You got to share a little hope with them.
Or at least give them space to hope.
Space to hope. That's it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to make up their own hope. But yeah, you can't close them in the coffin of adult despair. It's wrong. It's just dead wrong to do that.
Do you think that's what happens to adults' imagination as they get older? They close it down because, in response, I would say, to knowing too much about what happens in the larger world.
Part of it must be self-defense. Yeah. It's just kind of building up the fortress around oneself so one won't get hurt that same way again. One won't make that same stupid mistake again. But, of course, the only way you get anywhere is to go out and make mistakes and get hurt.
Do you think one of the pleasures of writing from a child's or an adolescent's point of view is putting yourself back in that space?
I wouldn't exactly call it a pleasure, because my adolescence was not unhappy by many people's terms, but it was just as anguished as most adolescences are, and to kind of get back into that is painful. You remember how everything hurt, and you were so confused. And everything was of the utmost importance always. Nothing, you couldn't take anything lightly, That's kind of actually where a lot of artists live, is in a kind of permanent adolescence of that kind. But it can be sort of hard to think yourself back into that. But it's also exciting.
One of the pleasures that I find, and I don't actually get a lot of pleasure out of writing. After finishing writing, maybe, but not while I'm doing it. But one of the things that's really fun for me is to refigure things out, to go back into a state of mind where you don't think you know what's happening, and you have a chance to re-examine it.
Yeah, and you have time to do it. Life is not coming at you full bore at 80 miles an hour. Yeah, you do have time to figure it out. That's true. I do enjoy writing. The actual act of composition is it's so much like a trance state to me that I can't say I either enjoy it or don't. I'm not present. This thing is happening. The part I like is just maybe later that day, revising, going back over.
You like rewriting?
I adore rewriting. That's the reward. I know, I'm very weird. But the composition, it's so hard, it's so exhausting. At the end of a couple of hours of writing, I'm kind of a shaky rag. But the revising part where you go back and you just fiddle with it and you get it right.
All the writers I
love
know, they say that rewrite is a 4-letter word.
I know.
Oh.
When I tell students rewriting is fun, they go,
Rewriting to me means you've finished the scary part.
Yeah.
And you can go back.
You've taken the risks. You survived. Something is on the page.
Yes.
And you can, you've got your clay to play with now. It's making the clay. It's tough.
Well, it's not that I don't rewrite. I mean, plenty of times, but
fear does not keep you from it entirely.
No, nor anticipation of pain. No. I do it. I do it over and over and over again.
Don't you? I like, it is like playing with clay or something to me. It's fiddling with the material and making it pretty, making it go right.
I suppose it's less like hacking through the bush, which is my
Yeah.
metaphor for writing.
Yeah. Hacking through. only you're not even sure it's a bush. It might be a wall. Yeah.
So this would be more like gardening.
Yeah. Exactly.
Eileen,
Yes, Nisi.
would you please ask Ursula to do us a big favor?
Oh, all right. Ursula, I noticed you have a copy of your new book, Gifts, with you.
I do.
Would you mind reading to us from it?
I'd love to.
Thank you.
Here's how Chapter 2 starts. To see that your life is a story while you're in the middle of living it may be a help to living it well. It's unwise, though, to think you know how it's going to go or how it's going to end. That's to be known only when it's over. And even when it's over, even when it's somebody else's life, somebody who lived 100 years ago, whose story I've heard told time and again, while I'm hearing it, I hope and fear as if I didn't know how it would end. And so I live the story, and it lives in me. That's as good a way as I know to outwit death. Stories are what death thinks he puts an end to. He can't understand that they end in him, but they don't end with him. Other people's stories may become part of your own, the foundation of it, the ground it goes on. So it was with my father's story of the blind Brantor, and his story of the raid on Dunnet, and my mother's stories of the lowlands, and of the time when Cumberlow was king. When I think of my childhood, I enter the hall of the stone house. I'm in the hearth seat, in the muddy courtyard or the clean stables of Caspermand. I'm in the kitchen garden with my mother picking beans, or with her by the hearth in the round tower room. I'm out on the open hills with Gry. I'm in the world of the never-ending stories.
Thank you, Ursula.
Thank you, Ursula.
You're very welcome.
Did you ever pick beans with your mother?
No, but I picked beans with an old friend in England. It was fun.
But that reminds me of another question I was going to ask about the book. One of the things I remember doing when I was younger was pretending to be blind. Auric spends a couple of years blindfolded, and it made me remember those not so funny games. Did you ever do that?
Yeah. I think a lot of kids do it, but fairly briefly.
Right, not for a year.
Of course, and there are games like Blind Man's Buff and so on, where somebody gets blindfolded. And those games do have a lot of tension and power to them. Yeah.
There was something in the 70s known as a blind walk that people used to do in sort of hippy-dippy sensitivity session things in which you would blindfold yourself and someone else would lead you around outside of a safe place, out into the marketplace in the street. And it's a very disturbing and affecting thing to do because you trust another person to take you across streets. And
I'm just remembering in junior high school we had a tiny little club and we had an initiation. And I was blindfolded for about half an hour and had to be led around into shops and things by my friends. And it was scary. It was really scary. I'd quite forgotten that.
Yeah, that reminds me of when I was actually a hippy-dippy and taking someone on a trust walk. I took her, down a few dunes, up a couple of bluffs. Yes, walked her into the lake, Lake Michigan.
I watched someone in Lake Michigan.
I was 15.
You were 15. Yeah.
I was 15.
Yeah.
I was doing all the things I would have wanted her to do for me. And then I later found out that she was pregnant. So she was trusting enough for herself, but to do all this while she's carrying a child.
And she knew it. She knew she was pregnant.
She knew she was pregnant. I didn't.
Well, she probably was pretty young, too.
Yeah.
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 immortality of the young.
Yeah. I don't remember my walk, but I remember leading someone else.
The part I remember vividly is being led into a store, and it was a cigar shop, and here we are, 13 years old, and I had to beg a cigar from the owner. It was his poor blind child, you see. And he went along with it. He gave me a cigar.
Oh,
Nice guy.
what a nice guy.
Berkeley was a nice town in those days.
Of course, now giving a cigar to a child is probably,
It's probably illegal
yeah,
now. It probably was illegal then, as a matter of fact. I don't know.
that's true.
Unless you had a note from your mother asking, could you please
No,
give
she
my
didn't- she
blind
didn't
daughter...
know- She didn't know all this was going on. Believe me, she didn't. She never did either.
What was the name of the club?
Allegro. We didn't get into any of the sororities, you know, these sort of Greek name things that they already had in junior high and high school. So we made 5 of us made our own club.
It sounds like fun.
The initiations were great. I don't think we did much else.
So this was entirely kid-generated?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I had some neat friends.
Sounds like very structured behavior for kids.
Well, we were imitating what we thought you did in a club, right?
Right.
And the first thing is an initiation, and I think beyond that we didn't know very much about what you did in a club, except you got together and giggled.
Pay dues.
We didn't know about that.
Just as well you have plenty of time to pay dues after you're grown up.
Yeah, you've probably paid your dues by now. Thanks a lot for coming and being with us and sharing
It was a pleasure.
sharing your gifts.
Maybe someday I can interview you. Ha-ha.
The end.